The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge, a town that clung to existence at the edge of the Rocky Mountains like a barnacle on a weathered ship's hull. It was the kind of place where dreams came to die and men came to disappear, where the law was whatever Sheriff Tom Brennan said it was, and justice was often found at the bottom of a whiskey bottle or the end of a rope. The crowd gathered early that September morning, drawn by the spectacle of seeing a wild man brought to heel. Women clutched their shawls tighter despite the warming air, while men spat tobacco juice into the dirt and muttered among themselves. Children were shooed away by their mothers, though many peeked around skirts and between legs to catch a glimpse of the prisoner. He came down the street flanked by 2 deputies, their rifles held at the ready as if escorting a rabid wolf rather than a man. And perhaps, to their eyes, there was little difference. His hair hung in matted tangles past his shoulders, streaked with premature gray, though he couldn't have been more than 35. A beard, unkempt and wild, obscured most of his face save for eyes that held the wary alertness of a hunted animal. His buckskin shirt, once perhaps a thing of craftsmanship, hung in tatters, revealing glimpses of scarred flesh beneath. Blood had dried brown on his knuckles, and his wrists were bound with iron shackles that clinked with each reluctant step. "That's him," old Martha Henley whispered to her neighbor, her voice carrying the delicious horror of scandal. "The mountain devil what killed poor Roy Patterson up by the old Fortuna mine. Killed him dead as Sunday chicken," agreed Josiah Mills. "The town's blacksmith. Cut him open like a hog for slaughter, they say." The prisoner's eyes swept across the gathering crowd, taking in their faces with an expression that might have been contempt or simple indifference. When little Tommy Garrett threw a clod of dirt that struck his shoulder, the man didn't even flinch. He simply continued walking, his gait steady despite the chains, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to navigating rough terrain. Deputy Ben Hawkins prodded him with his rifle barrel. "Move along, savage. Don't want to keep Judge Morrison waiting." The man's head turned slightly at the word savage, and for a moment, something flickered in those dark eyes. Not anger, but something deeper, older. A weariness that spoke of battles fought long before this morning's indignity. They were passing the Imperial Hotel when Deputy Jake Colton decided to show off for the crowd. "Hey boy," he called out, though the prisoner was clearly a grown man. "You even understand English, or do we need to grunt at you like the animal you are?" A ripple of nervous laughter ran through some of the onlookers. Others shifted uncomfortably, though whether from embarrassment or anticipation was hard to say. The prisoner stopped walking. Just stopped. Despite Hawkins's prodding, he turned his head fully toward Colton, and when he spoke, his voice was low and rough from disuse, but clear enough. "I understand you well enough, Deputy. Question is whether you understand yourself." The laughter died. Colton's face flushed red. "Why, you—" "That's enough." Sheriff Brennan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. He'd emerged from his office, a man built like an oak barrel with graying mutton chops and eyes that missed nothing. "Save it for the trial, Jake." The procession resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The prisoner had spoken, had revealed himself capable of more than grunts and violence. It unsettled them. This evidence of humanity in something they'd already condemned as beast. The Broken Wheel Saloon was doing booming business despite the early hour. Men who claimed they'd seen the body. Men who knew someone who'd seen the body. Men who'd heard from reliable sources about the body. All of them held court over whiskey and beer, each tale growing more gruesome in the telling. "Weren't just killed," Samuel Dobbs was saying, his voice hushed with theatrical horror. "Roy was torn apart, like a grizzly got him, only weren't no grizzly. This devil, he used his bare hands and a hunting knife, took Roy's scalp clean off." "That's not what I heard," countered William Pierce, the bank clerk. "I heard Roy was shot in the back, execution style. This wild man probably robbed him for his gold." "Roy didn't have no gold," scoffed Dobbs. "Everybody knows he was broke as a church mouse, spent everything on whiskey and other pursuits." The other pursuits were well known but rarely spoken of in polite company. Roy Patterson had been a man of particular appetites, especially when it came to the Indian women who sometimes came to town to trade. More than one had left with bruises hidden beneath their shawls. "Don't matter why he done it," declared Henry Vance, whose general store sat across from the saloon. "Man kills another man. He hangs. That's the law. That's civilization." "Here, here," several voices agreed. Glasses raised. Outside. They'd reached the jail, a squat building of stone and iron that served as both Sheriff Brennan's office and Cedar Ridge's approximation of justice. The crowd pressed closer, hoping for one last glimpse of drama before the prisoner disappeared inside. It was then that she appeared. The black carriage was fine, too fine for Cedar Ridge, with its polished wood and brass fixtures that caught the morning sun. The matched pair of bay horses that drew it were sleek and well-fed, their harnesses oiled to a shine. But it was the woman who stepped down from it that drew every eye and stopped every conversation. She wore traveling clothes of deep burgundy, the fabric rich and heavy, tailored to perfection. Her hair, a dark chestnut color, was swept up beneath a small hat adorned with a single ostrich feather. Her gloves were kid leather, her boots polished to mirror brightness. Everything about her spoke of money, breeding, and the kind of life lived far from the dust and desperation of Cedar Ridge. She paused on the sidewalk, surveying the scene with cool gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, the crowd, the deputies, and finally, the prisoner. When their gazes met, something passed between them. Quick as lightning and just as electric, the prisoner straightened slightly, his chains rattling. Then she was moving, walking toward the jail with the measured stride of someone accustomed to having her way. The crowd parted before her like the Red Sea before Moses, too stunned to do otherwise. "Ma'am." Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, touching the brim of his hat. "This ain't no place for a lady. We're just bringing in a prisoner. I'm aware of that. Sheriff?" Her voice was cultured, with the faint accent of Eastern education. "I've come about this matter." "About?" Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Ma'am, I don't understand. This man's killed someone. He's dangerous." She looked past him to where the prisoner stood between his guards, studying him as one might study a painting in a gallery, with interest but without fear. The prisoner, for his part, had gone very still, watching her with an intensity that made the deputies grip their rifles tighter. "Dangerous?" She turned back to the sheriff, and something in her expression might have been amusement. Perhaps, but then, "Sheriff, aren't we all dangerous in our own way?" "Ma'am, I really must insist. You must insist on nothing." The steel in her voice was subtle but unmistakable. "I have business here, and I'll conduct it. Now, shall we go inside? Or would you prefer to continue this discussion in the street?" The sheriff, faced with the kind of authority that came not from a badge but from breeding and bank accounts, found himself stepping aside. The woman swept past him and into the jail, leaving behind the scent of lavender and something else, something wild, like wind through pine trees. The prisoner was herded inside, and the heavy door swung shut, leaving the crowd buzzing with speculation. Who was she? What business could a lady like that have with a killer? Had she known Roy Patterson? Was she some relative come for justice? In the broken wheel, the stories were already morphing, growing new limbs and tentacles of speculation. But Samuel Dobbs, who'd been standing closest when the woman passed, swore he'd heard her murmur something as she looked at the prisoner. Just one word, soft as a prayer. Finally, the trial was set for 2 days hence. Judge Morrison, riding circuit from Denver, would arrive tomorrow. In the meantime, Cedar Ridge held its breath and waited, sensing that something had shifted in the cosmos, that the simple story of a wild man killing a townsman had become something else entirely. And in the jail, in the dim light filtering through barred windows, a man in chains sat on a narrow cot and wondered if salvation could wear burgundy and smell of lavender, or if he was simply trading one form of damnation for another. The silence in the Broken Wheel Saloon was absolute. as if every man present had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. Glasses remained frozen halfway to lips. Cards lay abandoned on tables, and even the bartender's perpetual polishing of glassware had ceased. The woman who'd just spoken stood in the doorway like something out of a dream, or a nightmare, depending on one's perspective. "I beg your pardon, ma'am," Samuel Dobbs finally managed, his voice cracking like a boy's. "Did you just say, 'I said that man is my husband'?" Her voice carried the same cool authority it had displayed outside, but now there was something else beneath it, a thread of steel that suggested she was not a woman accustomed to repeating herself. "Is there something unclear about that statement, Mr. Dobbs?" he supplied automatically. "Samuel Dobbs, ma'am, but surely there's some mistake. That savage, his name," she interrupted smoothly, "is Josiah Reed, and I'll thank you not to use that word in my presence again." The name rippled through the room. Josiah Reed. Suddenly, the wild man had a name, had a history, had a wife who dressed in burgundy silk and spoke like quality. It was as if they'd been told the mountain itself had a maiden name. Sheriff Brennan pushed through the crowd, his face a study in skepticism. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some proof of this. Marriage." "Of course." She reached into her traveling case with unhurried movements and withdrew a folded document. The paper was heavy, official-looking, with the territory seal of Montana visible even from a distance. "Married in Helena. 3 years ago this past June, Judge Harold Whitman presiding." Brennan took the document, examining it with the intense focus of a man looking for forgery and finding none. The signatures were clear, the seal authentic. He looked up at her, then back at the paper, as if hoping the words might rearrange themselves into something that made more sense. "This says your name is Rowena Worthington Reed. Rowena Elizabeth Worthington Reed," she corrected, "though I've been using my maiden name for personal reasons. Worthington." Henry Vance breathed the name like a prayer. Of the Boston Worthingtons. The shipping family? A slight incline of her head confirmed it. The revelation sent another shockwave through the room. The Worthingtons were money, old money, the kind that built libraries and funded expeditions. What in God's name was one of them doing married to a man who lived like an animal in the Rocky Mountains? "Well," Brennan said slowly, handing back the certificate, "this is irregular, but being married don't change the fact that your husband killed Roy Patterson." "Did he?" Rowena's eyebrows arched delicately. "Has there been a trial? Has evidence been presented? Or are you convicting him based on the testimony of whiskey and speculation?" "Now see here. What I see, Sheriff, is a rush to judgment that would make even a kangaroo court blush." She moved further into the room, and men scrambled to clear a path. "I've been traveling for 3 days. Gentlemen, 3 days since word reached me that my husband had been arrested. In that time, I've made certain inquiries." She paused at the bar, removing her gloves with deliberate precision. "Bartender, I'll have a whiskey. The good stuff, if you please, not whatever rotgut you're serving these gentlemen." The bartender, too stunned to argue, poured from a bottle he kept beneath the bar. She took a sip, nodded approval, then turned to face the room. "Roy Patterson," she said, the name falling from her lips like something distasteful. "Would anyone care to tell me about Mr. Patterson's character? His dealings with the vulnerable members of your community? No? How disappointing. Well then, let me tell you what I've learned." Her gaze swept the room, and more than one man found reason to study his boots. Mr. Patterson was known to frequent the camps where displaced Indian women sought work. He was not gentle in his attentions. 3 complaints were filed with this very sheriff's office over the past year. Would you care to tell me, Sheriff Brennan, what came of those complaints? Brennan's face had gone red. "Those women, they didn't have any proof. It was their word against Roy's." "Ah, yes. The word of Indian women against a white man. How could I forget the arithmetic of frontier justice?" The contempt in her voice was sharp enough to draw blood. "That don't give your husband the right to kill him?" someone called from the back. No, she agreed. It doesn't, but it does suggest that there might be more to this story than a wild man committing random murder, doesn't it? She finished her whiskey and set the glass on the bar with a decisive click. Now then, I understand the trial is in 2 days. Who's representing my husband? Well, Brennan shifted uncomfortably. We appointed Eugene Carver, but Mr. Carver has declined. Eugene himself spoke up from a corner table. His voice slurred with drink. I don't defend animals, Mrs. Reed. I see. Her tone suggested she saw far more than Eugene Carver would have liked. Then I suppose I'll have to make other arrangements. Sheriff, I'd like to see my husband now. Ma'am, visiting hours are for people without marriage certificates and Yale-educated lawyers on retainer. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Shall we go? The crowd parted again as she swept toward the door, Brennan trailing reluctantly in her wake. As they left, conversation exploded like a dam bursting. Everyone had an opinion, a theory, a suddenly remembered detail about either Roy Patterson or the mysterious mountain man who now had a name. In the jail, Josiah Reed sat exactly as he had for the past hour, still, silent, his dark eyes fixed on some point beyond the stone walls. The shackles were heavy on his wrists, but he'd worn heavier chains. The cell was small, but he'd survived in smaller spaces. What troubled him was not his captivity, but the ghost of lavender that still lingered in the air. When the door opened and she entered, flanked by a reluctant Brennan, he didn't move, didn't speak. Just watched as she approached the bars of his cell, her gray eyes taking in every detail, the bruises on his face, the dried blood on his shirt, the way he held himself despite the chains. Hello, Josiah, she said softly. The sound of his name on her lips was like a key turning in a long-locked door. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them to find her still there, still real. Rowena. His voice was rougher than it had been that morning, as if the single word had been dragged up from some deep place. You shouldn't have come. Shouldn't I? She turned to Brennan. Sheriff, I require privacy to consult with my husband. I can't leave you alone with my lawfully wedded husband. Her tone suggested he was testing the limits of her patience. Sheriff Brennan, I'm not asking. Something in her voice, or perhaps the mention of those Yale lawyers, convinced him. 10 minutes, he said grudgingly. I'll be right outside. When the door closed behind him, Rowena moved closer to the bars. In the lamplight, Josiah could see the fine lines around her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands that she was trying so hard to hide. You look tired, he said. You look like hell. The profanity sounded strange in her cultured voice, but also somehow right. What happened, Josiah? The truth. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, found him with a girl. Young one, Crow tribe. She couldn't have been more than 15. Rowena's jaw tightened. And I stopped him. Simple words for what had been anything but simple. Didn't mean to kill him, but he had a knife, and... He shrugged, the chains rattling. Maybe I didn't try as hard as I could have not to. The girl got away, back to her people. I hope. She's the witness they need. We have to find her. No. The word was sharp. Final. Leave her be. She's been through enough. Josiah, without her testimony. I said no. He stood then, moving to the bars with that fluid grace she remembered. Close enough that she could see the scar that ran through his left eyebrow. The one he'd gotten breaking a horse the week after they'd met. Why did you come, Rowena? Real reason. She met his gaze steadily. Because you're my husband. Am I? His laugh was bitter. 3 years. Row. 3 years of nothing. And now you show up when I'm fixing to hang? I couldn't. It was complicated. It always was with you. They stood there, separated by iron bars and 3 years of silence. And yet somehow closer than they'd been since that last morning in the cabin when she'd kissed him goodbye and promised to return in a week. He's dead. she said quietly. Charles. My first husband. Riding accident. 8 months ago. Something shifted in Josiah's expression. I'm sorry. Are you? No. The honesty was brutal, but not unkind. But I'm sorry you had to go back to him. Sorry for what it cost you. She reached through the bars then, her fingers finding the scar on his neck, the one that ran from ear to collar. He went still under her touch, like a wild thing deciding whether to flee or surrender. The war? She asked, though she knew the answer. Andersonville. The name of the Confederate prison camp was explanation enough. Among other places. Her hand trembled. I looked for you, when I could, but you disappeared into these mountains like smoke. Good at disappearing. His hand came up to cover hers, rough and warm and achingly familiar. Should have stayed disappeared. No. The word was fierce. No, you shouldn't have, and you won't hang. Not while I have breath in my body. Rowena, I've already wired for Lawrence Blackwood, best defense attorney in Denver. He'll be here tomorrow. Can't pay for... I can. She cut him off. What good is Worthington money if I can't use it to save the only man I've ever... She stopped, the words too dangerous to speak aloud. Ever what? His voice had gone low. Rough. You know what? Say it. Loved. She whispered. The only man I've ever loved. The confession hung between them like morning mist, fragile and perfect. Then Brennan was banging on the door. Announcing time was up, and the moment shattered. I'll be back tonight, she promised, stepping away from the bars. We have plans to make. Row. She turned back at his voice. That night, in the cabin, during the blizzard. You remember what you said? Her smile was sad and beautiful. That I'd fight the whole world for you if I had to. Don't make promises you can't keep. I never have. She moved toward the door, then paused. At least, not to you. Then she was gone, leaving behind the scent of lavender and the echo of possibilities. Josiah sank back onto his cot, chains clanking, and wondered if salvation could come 3 years too late, or if some sins were beyond even a Worthington's power to absolve. The courthouse of Cedar Ridge was a pretentious building, 2 stories of red brick that aspired to grandeur but achieved only an awkward formality. On the morning of the trial, it seemed to strain at its foundations under the weight of the crowd that had gathered. People had come from as far as Silver Creek and Marston's Hollow, drawn by the promise of spectacle, a wild man, a society woman, and a dead man's blood crying out for justice. Judge Cornelius Morrison presided from his high bench like a vulture on a perch, his black robes and hooded eyes adding to the carrion bird impression. He was known as a hanging judge, a man who believed civilization was held together by rope and fear, and his presence had already tilted the scales before a single word of testimony was spoken. The territory of Montana versus Josiah Reed, the bailiff intoned, his voice carrying over the packed courtroom. The charge is murder in the first degree. Josiah sat at the defendant's table, transformed by Rowena's interventions. His hair had been cut and combed, his beard trimmed to respectability. He wore a clean white shirt and black coat that fit well enough, though he held himself stiffly in the unfamiliar clothes. Beside him sat Lawrence Blackwood, looking every inch the Denver lawyer in his expensive suit and gold watch chain. The prosecution's case began with theatrical flair. District Attorney Marcus Whitley, ambitious and aware that this case could make his career, painted a picture of savage violence. "Gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice ringing with righteous conviction. "We are here to see justice done for Roy Patterson, a man cut down in his prime by the defendant, a man who chose to live outside the bounds of civilized society, who rejected the laws of God and man to prowl these mountains like a beast." He gestured dramatically toward Josiah. "Do not be fooled by his appearance today. Beneath those borrowed clothes beats the heart of a killer, a man who took it upon himself to be judge, jury, and executioner. The first witness was Ezra Holcomb, a prospector who claimed to have discovered the body. Tell us what you saw. Mr. Holcomb, Whitley prompted. Found Roy up by the old Fortuna mine, laid out in the dirt. Holcomb's eyes darted nervously between the prosecutor and Josiah. Blood everywhere. His throat was, well, it was opened up something awful. And did you see the defendant near the scene? Saw him standing over the body, knife in his hand. Blood on his clothes. When he saw me, he just stared, like he was deciding whether to kill me too. Objection. Blackwood rose smoothly. Speculation about my client's intentions. Sustained, Judge Morrison said grudgingly. The prosecution continued building its case with methodical precision. Roy Patterson's friends testified to his good character, carefully avoiding mention of his less savory habits. The sheriff described Josiah's arrest, emphasizing his wild appearance and initial silence. Through it all, Rowena sat in the front row of the gallery, her presence a constant reminder that this was no ordinary mountain man on trial. She wore deep blue today, somber but elegant, her eyes never leaving Josiah's face. When Blackwood rose for the defense, the atmosphere shifted. Where Whitley was fire and brimstone, Blackwood was cool precision. Mr. Holcomb, he began his cross-examination. You say you saw my client standing over the body. How far away were you? Maybe 50 yards? 50 yards. And what time of day was this? Near sunset. So visibility was poor, I could see well enough. Well enough to see blood on dark buckskin clothing at 50 yards in fading light. Blackwood's skepticism was palpable. Tell me, Mr. Holcomb, how much did Roy Patterson owe you? Holcomb's face flushed. I don't see what that... $20, wasn't it? For supplies? He was good for it. Was he? When was the last time Roy Patterson paid a debt? Objection. Whitley was on his feet. Roy Patterson is not on trial here. No, Blackwood agreed. But his character is central to understanding why he died. Your Honor, the defense intends to show that Roy Patterson was killed in defense of another, that his death, while regrettable, was the result of his own violent actions. Morrison's scowl deepened. Proceed, but carefully, Counselor. The next hour saw Blackwood systematically dismantling the prosecution's narrative. Under his questioning, witnesses admitted Roy's drinking, his violence, his particular interest in Indian women who had no legal recourse. You knew about these interests of Mr. Patterson's? Blackwood pressed Sheriff Brennan. Heard rumors. Brennan admitted reluctantly. Just rumors? No complaints filed. Some of the Indian women, they'd say things, but without proof. Without proof, you did nothing. And so Roy Patterson was free to continue his predations? Objection. Withdrawn. But the damage was done. Then came the moment that changed everything. The courtroom doors opened, and a young Crow woman entered, accompanied by an elderly white woman in missionary dress. The Indian girl couldn't have been more than 16, pretty in the way of youth, but with shadows in her eyes that spoke of harder truths. Your Honor, Blackwood announced, the defense calls Mary Singingbird to the stand. The prosecution erupted in objections. An Indian witness? A woman? The judge himself looked skeptical, but Blackwood pressed on. This witness is central to our case. Your Honor, she was present at the incident. Her testimony is crucial to understanding what truly happened that day. After much argument, Mary was allowed to testify, with the missionary woman, Sister Catherine, translating when necessary. The girl's voice was soft, but her words carried the weight of truth. Mr. Patterson, he found me gathering herbs near the stream, she began, her English careful but clear. He had whiskey smell, strong. He grabbed me, said things, bad things. What happened then? Blackwood asked gently. I fought, screamed, but he was stronger. He hit me. She touched her face, where the ghost of a bruise could still be seen. Then the mountain man came. Every eye in the courtroom turned to Josiah, who sat still as stone, his jaw tight. He told Mr. Patterson to let me go. Mr. Patterson laughed. Said Indian girls were for taking. Said no one would care. And then, Mr. Patterson pulled a knife. Said he would cut the mountain man for interfering. They fought. The mountain man. He tried only to stop him. But Mr. Patterson kept coming. In the struggle, the knife. She paused, gathering courage. The knife went into Mr. Patterson's throat. It was his own hand that pushed it there, fighting for control. The courtroom exploded. Whitley objected. Spectators shouted. Judge Morrison banged his gavel repeatedly for order. You're saying it was self-defense? Blackwood pressed when quiet was restored. The mountain man saved me, Mary said simply. Without him, I would be dead. Or worse. The cross-examination was brutal. Whitley questioned her morals, her presence alone near the mine, her ability to understand what she'd seen. But Mary held firm, and beside her, Sister Catherine's presence was a silent reproach to those who had dismissed the girl's testimony. She came to our mission 3 days ago. Sister Catherine testified when called, terrified, injured, but determined to speak the truth when she learned the man who saved her was to be tried for murder. As the first day of testimony concluded, the mood in Cedar Ridge had shifted. The simple narrative of savage killer and innocent victim had fractured into something more complex, more troubling. That evening, Rowena again visited Josiah in his cell. The guards had grown used to her presence, accepting the generous tips that ensured privacy. Why didn't you tell me about the girl? She asked. Didn't want her involved. Josiah replied, his voice weary. She's been through enough. She may have saved your life. At what cost? You saw how they looked at her, heard what they said. She'll be marked now for speaking against a white man, even a dead one. Rowena reached through the bars, taking his hands. You can't save everyone. Josiah can't save anyone, he corrected. Couldn't save my unit at Chancellorsville. Couldn't save my sister from the fever. Couldn't even save us. We saved each other, she said softly. That winter in the cabin, we saved each other. For what? So you could go back to a man you hated? So I could hide in these mountains like a ghost? So we could have this chance? She insisted. This moment, Josiah, when you walk free. If I walk free. When? She repeated firmly. What then? Do we go back to the way things were? You and your mountains, me and my empty mansion. He studied her face in the lamplight. What are you asking? Ro? I'm asking if you can forgive me. For leaving, for choosing the easy path instead of the right one, for taking 3 years to find the courage to come back. Nothing to forgive. His thumbs traced circles on her wrists. You did what you had to do. We both did. I did what I was expected to do, she corrected. There's a difference. Charles needed a wife to secure a business deal with my father. I needed to protect my family from scandal. You were the price we all paid. Your family can go hang themselves. The vulgarity was deliberate, defiant. I've spent 3 years being the perfect widow, the dutiful daughter. I'm done, Josiah. Whatever happens in that courtroom tomorrow, I'm done living for everyone else's expectations. He pulled her closer to the bars, close enough that she could rest her forehead against the cool iron. Don't make decisions based on what might happen to me. If Morrison has his way, then I'll fight him. I'll fight them all. The fierce whisper carried all the passion of that long-ago promise in the cabin. The question is, will you fight with me? Or are you so in love with your guilt that you'd rather hang than try to live? The challenge hung between them. Finally, Josiah lifted his head, meeting her eyes with something that might have been hope. Ask me again when this is over, he said. When you can see me without these bars between us. When you know for certain what kind of man I've become. I know what kind of man you are, Rowena said. The kind who would risk his life to save a young girl from a predator. The kind who carries his scars with dignity. The kind I've loved since the moment you pulled me from that blizzard. A guard's approach ended their conversation, but as Rowena left, Josiah called after her. Ro, tomorrow, whatever happens, thank you for coming back. She paused at the door. I never really left. My body was in Boston, but my heart has been in these mountains for 3 years. As night fell over Cedar Ridge, The town settled into uneasy sleep. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments, jury deliberation, and verdict. Justice would be served, though whether it would be the rope's justice or truth's justice remained to be seen. In her hotel room, Rowena sat at the window, watching the stars appear over the mountains. In his cell, Josiah did the same through iron bars. And somewhere in the mission house, a young Crow woman prayed to gods both old and new that her truth would be enough to save the man who had saved her. The wheels of justice would turn come morning, but tonight the world held its breath and waited. The attack came at dusk, when the autumn light painted the mountains crimson and the shadows grew long between the buildings of Cedar Ridge. Rowena had just emerged from the telegraph office, having wired her father's attorneys for additional documents, when the first rock struck her carriage. "Murderer's whore!" The voice came from behind a stack of crates, followed by another stone that cracked against the wheel. Her driver, Thomas, a steady man she'd brought from Denver, reached for the rifle beneath his seat, but Rowena stayed him with a gesture. "No, that's what they want." More figures emerged from the gathering darkness. 5 men, maybe 6, their faces obscured by shadow and malice. She recognized one as Pete Garrison, Roy Patterson's drinking companion, his breath sour with whiskey even from 10 feet away. "Think you can come here with your money and your fancy lawyers?" Garrison spat. "Buy justice for that savage?" "I think," Rowena said clearly, "that justice doesn't need to be bought when the truth is free for the telling." "Truth?" Another man laughed harshly. "Only truth is Roy's dead and your husband done it. Then let the jury decide that. Maybe we'll decide it right here." Garrison moved closer, and his companions followed, forming a loose semicircle that blocked her path to the hotel. "Maybe you need a lesson about interfering where you don't belong." Thomas's hand moved again toward his weapon, but Rowena remained steady. She'd faced down Boston society matrons and railroad barons. She wouldn't flinch before drunk vigilantes. "Mr. Garrison," she said, her voice carrying the authority of generations of Worthington women, "you're making a serious mistake. Touch me or my property, and you'll discover exactly how far my interference can reach. I have lawyers in Denver, San Francisco, and Washington. Do you really want to test their reach?" For a moment, the threat of distant legal power held them. Then Garrison's face twisted. "To hell with your lawyers!" He lunged forward, grabbing for her arm. Rowena twisted away, but his fingers caught her sleeve, tearing the fabric. Thomas was moving now, the rifle swinging up, but there were too many of them, too close. The axe took Garrison's hat off without touching a hair on his head, embedding itself in the wooden post beside him with a solid thunk. Everyone froze. Josiah Reed stood at the mouth of the alley, his recently acquired respectability shed like snakeskin. Someone had made the mistake of leaving him unwatched during the shift change, or perhaps Sheriff Brennan had developed a convenient blindness. He wore only his shirt and trousers, no coat against the evening chill. But he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on Garrison with the focused intensity of a predator. "Step away from her." The words were quiet, conversational almost, but they carried an edge sharp enough to cut. "You're supposed to be locked up," one of the men stammered. "Supposed to be a lot of things." Josiah moved forward with that fluid mountain grace. "Step away. Won't say it again." Garrison released Rowena's sleeve, his bravado crumbling. "This ain't over. Reed. You can't protect her forever. Don't need forever." Josiah positioned himself between Rowena and the men. "Just need right now." The vigilantes retreated, muttering threats and promises, but retreated nonetheless. Only when they disappeared into the darkness did Josiah turn to Rowena, his expression shifting from dangerous to concerned. "You hurt?" "No." She examined her torn sleeve with annoyance. "Though I'll need to change before—" She stopped, really looking at him. "You're out. How?" Brennan had to use the privy. Deputy Colton was watching me, but he got distracted by a bottle he didn't know he had in his desk drawer. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Might have been helped there by someone who appreciates irony. "You broke out. They'll use this against you. Didn't break nothing. Door was open. Just went for a walk. Happens I walked in the right direction. He retrieved his axe from the post with an easy motion. Come on, let's get you inside before they find their courage in another bottle. He escorted her to the Imperial Hotel, Thomas following with the carriage. In the lobby, under the gaslight, she could see the strain around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. You need to go back, she said, before they... I know. He glanced around the lobby. Empty, save for the desk clerk who was studiously examining his ledger. Ro, those men, they're not going to stop. Maybe you should... Don't! Her voice was sharp. Don't you dare suggest I leave. It's dangerous. So was that blizzard 3 years ago. You didn't send me away then. That was different. Why? Because then you thought I was worth protecting. He caught her hand, his calloused fingers gentle on her wrist. Because then I had the right to protect you. Now, I'm just a man on trial for murder. Being near me will destroy your reputation. My reputation? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Josiah, I spent 3 years as Charles Worthington's wife. I know what destroyed looks like. This is just gossip. I've survived worse. Have you? The question hung between them, loaded with 3 years of unspoken truths. Rowena looked away first. We should go to your room, Josiah said quietly. Need to look at that shoulder properly. It's fine. Humor me. They climbed the stairs in silence. In her room, with the door closed and the lamps lit, the pretense of propriety fell away. Josiah examined her shoulder with gentle efficiency, finding bruises already forming where Garrison had grabbed her. Should put something cold on that, he murmured, his fingers barely ghosting over the marks. It's nothing, but she shivered at his touch, and not from pain. Rowena, he stepped back, putting distance between them. What happened? Really? After you left the cabin? She moved to the window, looking out at the dark mountains. I went back to Denver, as planned. I was going to get my things, leave a letter for Charles, come back to you. But he was there, with my father. They'd figured out where I'd gone. And my father explained, very calmly, what would happen if I didn't return to my marriage, how he'd ruin you. Have you arrested for kidnapping, assault, whatever charges money could buy, how he'd make sure you hanged. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled on the windowsill. I was 22, Josiah. I believed him. So you went back. I went back, played the dutiful wife, let Charles parade me at his business dinners, smiled when he touched me, died a little more each day. She turned to face him. I lost the baby 2 months later, his baby, yours. The doctor said it was the stress, but I think it knew it wasn't wanted in that life. The silence stretched taut between them. Josiah's face had gone pale beneath his sun-weathered skin. Don't apologize. Don't you dare apologize for something that wasn't your fault. She crossed to him, taking his face in her hands. We've both paid for that winter, paid in different ways, but paid all the same. I looked for you, he admitted. Went to Denver that spring. Saw the announcement in the paper, the Worthingtons celebrating their reconciliation. Saw you on his arm outside the hotel. You were there? Across the street. You looked... He paused, searching for words. Empty, like someone had blown out your light. That's when I knew I had to let you go. You'd chosen your life. I chose nothing. The words burst from her. I survived. There's a difference. And now? Now I choose. She pressed closer, feeling his warmth through the thin shirt. I choose you, if you'll have me, after the trial, after everything. Rowena. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs tracing her cheekbones. If I swing tomorrow, you won't. But if I do, then I'll cut you down myself and breathe life back into your stubborn body. The fierce declaration broke something in him. He pulled her against him, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that tasted of desperation and promise. 3 years dissolved in that moment. She was 22 again, snowbound and fearless. He was the soldier-turned-trapper who'd saved her life and stolen her heart. The world beyond these walls ceased to exist. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Josiah rested his forehead against hers. "I should go back, before they send a search party." "Stay." The word slipped out before she could stop it. "Just stay a little longer." He looked at her, and she saw her own hunger reflected in his dark eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped back and began unbuttoning his shirt. "Josiah, want to show you something." He shrugged out of the garment, revealing a torso mapped with scars. Some old, the war wounds she remembered, but others newer. "This one's from a grizzly 2 winters ago." He indicated a set of parallel marks across his ribs. "This from a rock slide last spring. This—" He turned, showing her his back. She gasped. The scars here were deliberate, systematic. Whip marks. "Andersonville," he said simply. "Among other things. Want you to see what you're choosing. Row, all of it." She moved to him, her fingers tracing the brutal history written on his skin. "Do you want to see mine?" she asked softly. He turned, confused. She began unbuttoning her dress with steady fingers, letting it fall, stood before him in her chemise and corset, then loosened those too. The bruises on her shoulder were fresh, but there were others, faded now but still visible to one who knew how to look. "Charles had particular ways of showing displeasure," she said quietly. "Never where it would show in a ball gown, of course." Josiah's face went dark with rage, his fists clenching. "If he weren't already dead—" "But he is!" She stepped into his arms, skin to skin, scar to scar. "He's dead, and we're alive, and I won't let his ghost stand between us anymore." What happened next was inevitable as sunrise, a collision of need and tenderness, of 3 years' separation and a lifetime's longing. They came together like storm and harbor, each finding in the other both destruction and salvation. Later, much later, they lay entwined in her bed, the sheets tangled around them. The lamp had burned low, casting golden shadows on the walls. "I really do have to go back," Josiah murmured against her hair. "I know," but she held him tighter, unwilling to break the spell. Tomorrow we face whatever comes, together." He tilted her chin up, studying her face in the dim light. "You sure about this? About us? Life with me won't be easy. I'm not a society man. Ro, never will be." "Good." She traced the scar through his eyebrow. "I've had enough of society to last a lifetime. I want something real, something true. Even if it means living in a cabin in the mountains, chopping wood and hauling water. Especially if it means that—" She smiled. "Though I might insist on some improvements. Glass windows, perhaps. A proper stove. Demanding woman. You have no idea." They dressed slowly, reluctantly. At the door, Josiah pulled her close one more time. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we've already won." She interrupted. "Don't you see? They can't take this from us. Not again." He kissed her once more, then slipped out into the hallway. She listened to his footsteps fade, then moved to the window, watched as he emerged from the hotel and walked back toward the jail, his stride unhurried, almost casual. Sheriff Brennan met him at the door, and she could see their brief conversation. Josiah's gesture toward the hotel, protecting her even now. The door closed behind him, but Rowena remained at the window, watching the stars wheel overhead. In a few hours, dawn would break. The trial would conclude. Their fate would be decided by 12 men who might value Roy Patterson's life more than Mary Singing Bird's virtue. But for now, for these last dark hours, she held close the memory of his skin against hers, of promises made without words, of a love that had survived 3 years of winter to bloom again in this unlikely season. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight, she had chosen, and been chosen in return. That was enough. That was everything. The closing arguments began under a sky heavy with unshed rain, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and crowding the doorways. Word of the previous evening's confrontation had spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, adding another layer of tension to an already charged atmosphere. Lawrence Blackwood rose first, his manner calm and methodical as he approached the jury. "Gentlemen," he began, "you have heard testimony that Roy Patterson died. This is not in dispute. But you have also heard testimony about how and why he died. Testimony that paints a very different picture than the prosecution would have you believe." He paced slowly, making eye contact with each juror in turn. Mary Singing Bird, at great personal cost, came forward to tell you what truly happened that day. A young woman, alone and defenseless, attacked by a man who believed his skin color gave him the right to take what he wanted. And Josiah Reed, a man who chose isolation not from savagery, but from principle, intervened. "The prosecution wants you to see my client as a wild man, a killer who acted outside the law. But I ask you, what law protected Mary Singing Bird? What justice was available to her before Josiah Reed arrived?" Sheriff Brennan himself admitted that complaints against Patterson were dismissed, ignored, swept under the rug of convenience. Blackwood paused at the defense table, his hand resting briefly on Josiah's shoulder. "Sometimes, gentlemen, the law fails. Sometimes, justice must come from unexpected quarters. Josiah Reed didn't set out to kill anyone that day. He set out to save someone. The fact that Roy Patterson died was a result of Patterson's own violence, his own refusal to release his victim even when confronted. The defense asks you to consider not just the letter of the law, but its spirit, to remember that justice is not merely punishment for the guilty, but protection for the innocent. Mary Singing Bird is alive today because Josiah Reed acted. How many other young women might have suffered if he hadn't?" Marcus Whitley's rebuttal was fierce and uncompromising. "Gentlemen of the jury, do not be swayed by emotional appeals and attempts to blacken a dead man's character. The law is clear. One man killed another. Everything else is justification after the fact." He pointed dramatically at Josiah. "This man chose to live outside civilization, to reject the very foundations of our society. And when he encountered something he didn't like, he responded with violence, deadly violence. If we excuse this, if we say that any man can appoint himself judge and executioner, then what separates us from chaos? Roy Patterson cannot speak for himself, cannot defend himself against these accusations. We have only the word of an Indian girl." He paused, letting the implications hang. "And the convenient testimony of a woman who appeared after 3 years to claim a husband she, apparently, forgot she had." Several jurors shifted uncomfortably at this, glancing toward Rowena in the gallery. She sat perfectly still, her face composed despite the insult. "The prosecution asks you to uphold the law," Whitley concluded, "to send a message that in Cedar Ridge, in Montana Territory, we do not tolerate vigilante justice. We do not allow men to kill with impunity, regardless of their claimed motivations. Find Josiah Reed guilty of murder, and let justice be done." Judge Morrison's instructions to the jury were perfunctory and biased, emphasizing the narrow legal definition of justifiable homicide and minimizing the context of the killing. By the time he finished, it seemed he'd all but directed a guilty verdict. The jury filed out, and the courtroom erupted in conversation. Rowena made her way to the defense table, where Blackwood was gathering his papers. "How long do you think they'll deliberate?" she asked. "Hard to say," Blackwood admitted. "Could be hours, could be days. The evidence of self-defense is strong, but," he glanced toward the jury room, "prejudice can be stronger than evidence." Josiah spoke for the first time since the trial began. "Take Rowena somewhere safe. This crowd—" "I'm not going anywhere," Rowena said firmly. "No." She sat beside him, her posture declaring her intentions more clearly than words. "We wait together." The hours crawled by. The crowd in the courtroom thinned and swelled as people went for meals or fresh air. But always there were watchers, waiting. Through the windows, they could see storm clouds gathering over the mountains. darkening the afternoon to premature twilight. It was near sunset when the bailiff announced the jury's return. The crowd pressed back into the courtroom, the air thick with anticipation and the approaching storm. Lightning flickered beyond the windows as the 12 men filed back to their seats. "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison's voice held a note of satisfaction, as if he already knew the answer. The foreman, a rancher named Samuel Hayes, stood slowly. His weathered face was troubled, and he didn't look at Josiah as he spoke. "We have, Your Honor, on the charge of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant." He paused, and in that pause, the world held still. "Not guilty by reason of defense of another." The courtroom exploded. Shouts of outrage mixed with scattered applause. Judge Morrison's gavel cracked like gunshots as he demanded order. Through it all, Josiah sat frozen, as if he couldn't quite process the words. Rowena's hand found his under the table, squeezing tight. "It's over," she whispered. "You're free." But freedom in a courtroom and freedom in Cedar Ridge were two different things. As Josiah stood, Pete Garrison's voice cut through the chaos. "This ain't justice. This is what money buys." More voices joined his, angry and aggressive. The crowd began to press forward, held back only by the bailiffs and a few level-headed citizens. Sheriff Brennan moved to Josiah's side, his hand on his pistol. "Might be best if you and the lady leave town for a spell," he said quietly. "Let tempers cool." "We're not running," Josiah replied, his voice steady. "Then you're fools." Brennan's expression was grim. "I can't protect you from a mob. Read, not if they really want blood." Thunder crashed overhead, and the first fat drops of rain began to strike the windows. As if the storm was a signal, the crowd surged forward again, more aggressive now. Someone threw something, a bottle that shattered against the defense table. "Out the back," Blackwood urged, gathering his papers hastily. "My carriage is waiting." They moved as a group, Josiah, Rowena, Blackwood, and surprisingly, Sister Catherine with Mary Singing Bird. The nun had appeared at Rowena's elbow, her face calm despite the chaos. "The mission has sanctuary," she said simply, "if you need it." They made it to the back door, but found it blocked. Pete Garrison and his compatriots had anticipated this route. More men were joining them, faces ugly with drink and disappointment. "Thought you'd sneak out?" Garrison sneered. "Not this time." "Murderer!" Josiah stepped forward, pushing Rowena behind him. "I was acquitted. It's done." "Nothing's done till we say it's done," someone shouted. The confrontation might have turned violent then, but the storm intervened. Lightning struck nearby, the thunder immediate and deafening. Rain began to fall in sheets, turning the alley into a river. In the confusion of wind and water, Sheriff Brennan and his deputies managed to form a barrier. "Everyone go home," Brennan shouted over the storm. "Anyone still here in 2 minutes gets a night in jail." The combination of official threat and natural fury broke the mob's cohesion. Men scattered for shelter, though not without backward glances and muttered threats. Garrison was the last to go, pointing at Josiah through the rain. "This ain't over. Read! Not by a long shot." When they were gone, Brennan turned to the group, water streaming from his hat. "Get to the mission. Stay there tonight. Tomorrow, you leave town. That's not a request." They made it to the mission through streets turned to muddy torrents. Sister Catherine led them to a small building behind the main chapel. Simple but clean and dry. Mary Singing Bird built up the fire while the others shed wet coats and tried to collect themselves. "I should not have come forward," Mary said quietly, speaking for the first time since her testimony. "Now there is more danger." "No," Rowena said firmly, kneeling beside the girl. "You did the right thing, the brave thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Josiah stood by the window, watching the storm lash the town. "Brennan's right. We need to leave." "And go where?" Rowena asked. He turned to her, and for the first time since the verdict, something like peace crossed his features. "I know a place, up in the high country. A valley where I spent last winter. Good water, shelter, game. Far enough from here that we could build something without interference. We? Rowena's voice was carefully neutral. If you meant what you said, about choosing, about us. She crossed to him, taking his hands. I meant every word. It won't be easy. The cabin needs work. Winter comes hard up there. No society, no servants, no... Josiah. She placed a finger on his lips, silencing him. I've had society and servants. I've had an easy life. It nearly killed me. I choose hard. I choose real. I choose you. He pulled her close, and they stood together watching the storm rage over Cedar Ridge. Behind them, Blackwood cleared his throat. I'll need to return to Denver tomorrow, but I can arrange for your belongings to be sent, Mrs. Reed. And there are some legal matters, property transfers, accounts to be settled. Thank you, Rowena said without turning. For everything. My pleasure. It's not often a lawyer gets to see actual justice done. He paused. There is one more thing, Mr. Reed. Are you aware that Roy Patterson filed a mining claim on that land near where he died? It's been tied up in dispute, but with him gone and no heirs. Josiah shrugged. Don't want it. Perhaps not. But the claim could be valuable. I could arrange for it to be sold. The proceeds used to, well, to start your new life. Call it a wedding gift from the legal system that nearly failed you. Rowena looked at Josiah. It would help. Windows and a stove aren't free. A slight smile touched his lips. All right, Blackwood, arrange it. The storm continued through the night, but by dawn it had blown itself out, leaving Cedar Ridge washed clean and gleaming in the early light. The small party gathered in the mission's courtyard. Josiah and Rowena, Mary Singing Bird, who had decided to remain with Sister Catherine, and Thomas the driver with Rowena's luggage. You could stay, Sister Catherine said. Face them down. You have the right. Rights and wisdom aren't always the same thing. Josiah replied. Besides, we've got building to do before winter. They took 2 horses and a pack mule, leaving the fancy carriage behind. As they rode out of Cedar Ridge, a few early risers watched from doorways and windows, some with hostility, some with relief, a few with what might have been respect. At the edge of town, Rowena turned in her saddle for one last look. No regrets? None, Josiah said. You? Only that it took us 3 years to get here. They turned toward the mountains, toward the high country where the air was thin and clear and the past couldn't follow. Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew smaller, becoming just another collection of buildings clinging to the edge of civilization. Tell me about this valley, Rowena said as they climbed higher. Tell me about our home. And Josiah did, his voice growing warm with the telling, painting pictures of meadows and streams, of mountains that touched the sky and winters that tested the soul. Rowena listened and asked questions and began to dream of windows and stoves and perhaps, in time, the laughter of children who would know no bounds between wild and civilized, who would grow up free in a place their parents had carved from wilderness and will. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the storm clouds, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out, not in warning, but in welcome, as if the mountains themselves were calling them home. The stranger arrived on a gray morning 3 weeks after the trial, when frost still clung to the grass and mist wound through the valley like ghostly fingers. Josiah saw him first from the ridge where he'd been checking trap lines, a lone rider picking his way up the narrow trail that led to their hidden sanctuary. He moved quickly but quietly back to the cabin, where Rowena was kneading bread dough on the rough table they'd built together their first week. She looked up at his expression, her hands stilling. Trouble? Maybe. Rider coming up the trail. Stay inside. She wiped her hands clean, moving to where the Winchester hung on pegs by the door. Together, remember? He almost argued, then nodded. 3 weeks of mountain life had already begun to strip away the veneer of Eastern society. Her hair was bound in a simple braid, Her dress was practical wool rather than silk, and her hands bore the calluses of real work, but her spine was still straight as steel, her gray eyes still fierce with determination. They waited on the porch as the rider approached, Josiah's hand resting on his holstered Colt. But as the man drew closer, Josiah's tension shifted to something else, recognition mixed with old pain. "I'll be damned," he muttered. The rider was perhaps 50, lean and weathered, with the straight-backed posture of a career soldier despite his civilian clothes. His hair had gone iron gray, and a patch covered his left eye, but the right one was sharp as ever, taking in every detail of the homestead. "Josiah," the man said, reining in his horse at a respectful distance. "Been a long time. Captain Morrison." Josiah's voice was carefully neutral. "Thought you were dead." "Likewise." The man's gaze shifted to Rowena, and he touched his hat brim. "Ma'am, William Morrison, formerly of the 2nd Colorado Infantry. I served with your husband during the war." "You're the judge's brother," Rowena said, understanding dawning. "The one who came forward with evidence about Roy Patterson." "Half-brother," Morrison corrected. "Cornelius and I haven't spoken in years. Different views on justice, you might say." He looked back at Josiah. "May I step down? Long ride from Denver." Josiah nodded slowly. Morrison dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose bones remembered too many battles. Up close, the family resemblance to the hanging judge was clear, though William's face held none of his brother's cruel satisfaction. "Coffee?" Rowena offered, the mountain courtesy overriding caution. "I'd be grateful, ma'am." They sat on the porch, the morning sun finally burning through the mist. Morrison cradled his coffee cup like a man who'd spent too many cold nights on watch, his single eye studying the valley. "You've done well for yourself," he said finally. "Good defensive position, water source, clear fields of fire, still thinking like a soldier. Old habits." Josiah replied. "Why are you here, Captain?" Morrison reached into his coat, withdrawing a leather portfolio. "Officially? To deliver these papers from Blackwood. The mining claim came through, quite valuable. As it turns out, unofficially." He paused, his weathered face troubled. "To warn you, and to ask for your help." "Warn us about what?" Rowena asked. "Pete Garrison didn't take the verdict well. Neither did some others. They've been talking, making plans. My brother might wear the judge's robes, but he's not above looking the other way when frontier justice serves his purposes. We knew there might be trouble," Josiah said. "That's why we left." "You left, but you didn't disappear. People talk. Trappers, traders, travelers. Word gets around where the wild man and his Boston bride settled." Morrison's expression was grim. "Garrison's been gathering men, not just local thugs. He's reached out to some hard cases from the mining camps, the kind who'll do anything for gold. How many? 8, maybe 10. They're planning to come up here, finish what they think the law failed to do." Rowena's hand found Josiah's. "When?" "Soon. Maybe a week, maybe less. The first snow will close the high passes, so if they're coming, it'll be before then." "And you rode all this way to warn us?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, then spoke softly. "I owed you a debt. Josiah, from Chancellorsville." "You don't owe me anything. I'm sitting here drinking coffee because you carried me 3 miles through Confederate lines with 2 bullets in your back. Every day since has been a gift. So yes, I owe you." "That was war. This is different." "Is it?" Morrison's eye glinted. "Seems to me it's the same fight it's always been. Men who think might makes right against those who stand for something better." "What kind of help are you offering?" Rowena asked practically. "First, information. I've scouted their camp, know their numbers and weapons. Second, myself. This old soldier's still got some fight left." He paused. "And third, I didn't come alone. There are 2 men waiting down by the creek, Patrick O'Brien and Samuel Hayes." Josiah straightened. "O'Brien I don't know. But Hayes, he was foreman of the jury." "He was—" "Seems sitting in judgment on you opened his eyes to some things. He's been questioning what kind of town Cedar Ridge wants to be. When he heard about Garrison's plans, he volunteered to help stop them. And O'Brien? Former sergeant, served under me in the territories. Good man in a fight. More importantly, he's got no love for vigilantes. Lost his brother to a lynch mob in Kansas. Josiah stood, pacing to the edge of the porch. The valley spread before them, peaceful in the morning light. The meadow where they'd planned to build a barn. The creek where Rowena had learned to fish. The distant peaks that stood like sentinels. A good place. A place worth defending. We could run again, Rowena said quietly, reading his thoughts. Find somewhere else. Could, he agreed. But then we'd always be running. Always looking over our shoulders. So we make our stand here. He turned to her, seeing not the Boston socialite, but the woman who'd helped him patch the roof in a thunderstorm, who'd faced down a black bear with nothing but a skillet and fierce determination, who'd chosen this hard life with joy rather than resignation. Your choice too, he said. Equal partners. Remember? She stood, moving to stand beside him. Then I choose to fight for our home, Morrison smiled grimly. Spoken like a soldier's wife. All right then, let's talk tactics. They spent the morning planning. Morrison's scouts had confirmed Garrison's group was camped at Benson's trading post, 2 days' ride away. They were well armed, but undisciplined, relying on numbers and surprise. They don't know I'm here, Morrison explained, sketching a rough map on the table. Or that you've been warned. They're planning to hit you at dawn, catch you sleeping. Except we won't be sleeping, Josiah said. And we won't be here. As the plan took shape, O'Brien and Hayes were called up from the creek. O'Brien was a compact Irishman with scarred knuckles and quick eyes. Hayes looked older than his 50 years, the weight of his decision clear on his face. Never thought I'd be defending the man I helped judge, Hayes said, shaking Josiah's hand. But right is right, and what Garrison's planning ain't right. Why risk it? Rowena asked. You have family, a ranch. Ma'am, I sat in that courtroom and listened to that girl tell what Patterson did to her. Listened to how the sheriff ignored it, how the town let it happen. If we don't draw a line somewhere, what kind of place are we leaving for our children? They worked through the afternoon, preparing the homestead's defenses while making it appear normal from a distance. Josiah and O'Brien reinforced the cabin's walls and dug rifle pits. Morrison positioned supplies and ammunition. Hayes and Rowena prepared medical supplies and organized the weapons. As sunset approached, Morrison called them together. Last chance to reconsider, no shame in withdrawing. The only shame, Rowena said firmly, would be in letting them drive us from our home. All right then. Morrison's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a battle to plan. That night, they ate a simple meal together. 5 unlikely allies bound by circumstance and principle. Morrison told stories of the war, carefully edited to skip the worst horrors. O'Brien sang Irish ballads in a surprisingly sweet tenor. Hayes spoke of his hopes for Montana's future, a place where law meant justice rather than power. Later, as the others bedded down in the barn, Josiah and Rowena sat by their fire, the rifle across his knees, her head on his shoulder. Scared? He asked softly. Terrified, she admitted. But not of dying, of losing this, of losing you. You won't lose me. You can't promise that. Watch me. He tilted her chin up, his eyes fierce in the firelight. I survived Andersonville. The war, 3 years in these mountains, thinking I'd lost you forever. You think I'm going to let Pete Garrison and his thugs take me from you now? She kissed him then, pouring all her fear and love and determination into it. When they parted, her smile was shaky but real. All right then, but if you get yourself killed, Josiah Reed, I'll follow you to the afterlife just to give you hell about it. Wouldn't expect anything less. They made love that night with desperate tenderness, aware it might be their last time. Every touch was memorized, every whispered word a promise. When dawn came, they would face whatever came together, but tonight was theirs alone. In the morning, Morrison's assessment proved accurate. His scouts reported Garrison's force moving up the lower trail, confident and careless. 10 men, armed but not expecting resistance. "Remember," Morrison said as they took their positions, "we're not trying to massacre them. We give them a chance to withdraw, but if they refuse, they made their choice." Josiah finished grimly. Rowena squeezed his hand once more, then moved to her position, rifle ready. The morning mist clung to the valley, providing perfect cover. Somewhere below, hoofbeats echoed on stone. The confrontation was coming. But this time, Josiah Reed wouldn't face it alone. This time, he had something worth fighting for and people willing to fight beside him. This time, the wild man had become a man with a home, and that made all the difference. The sun broke through the mist, painting the mountains gold, and in the distance, growing closer, came the sound of horses and harsh voices, bringing violence to paradise. But paradise would be ready. The first riders appeared through the morning mist like phantoms, their horses' breath steaming in the cold mountain air. Pete Garrison rode at the front, his face set with the grim satisfaction of a man about to settle a score. Behind him, 9 others spread out in loose formation, rifles across their saddles, pistols at their hips. From his concealed position above the trail, Josiah counted them through his rifle sights. 10, as Morrison had predicted. Hard men all, the kind who'd survived the mining camps and frontier towns by being meaner than their neighbors. But they rode easy, confident, expecting to find a sleeping homestead and unsuspecting victims. They were about to learn otherwise. Morrison's voice carried clear in the still morning air as he stepped from cover, rifle leveled but not aimed directly at anyone. "That's far enough, gentlemen." The riders pulled up sharp, horses dancing nervously. Garrison's hand went to his pistol, but Morrison's steady voice stopped him. "Captain William Morrison, formerly U.S. Army. You're trespassing on private property with evident hostile intent. Turn around now, and no blood needs to be shed." "Morrison?" Garrison's face twisted. "The judge's brother? What the hell are you doing here?" "Preventing a murder." Morrison replied calmly. "You've got 10 seconds to turn those horses around. Or what?" One of the other riders, a scarred man with dead eyes, spat tobacco juice. "You'll arrest us, soldier boy." "No," Josiah said, stepping into view on the opposite ridge, his Winchester aimed at Garrison's chest. "We'll defend ourselves." The riders' heads swiveled, suddenly aware they were in a crossfire position. O'Brien and Hayes revealed themselves from other positions, creating a deadly box of overlapping fire zones. 4 against 10. Garrison tried to laugh, but it came out strained. "Those ain't good odds. Read." 5, Rowena's voice corrected as she emerged from the cabin, rifle steady in her hands. "And we have the high ground. Your move, Mr. Garrison." For a moment, the tableau held 10 mounted men in the killing ground between ridges, 5 defenders with every advantage of position and preparation. The morning sun broke fully through the mist, painting the scene in stark clarity. "This is murder," Garrison shouted. "Roy was my friend. Roy Patterson was a predator." Josiah replied, his voice carrying clearly. "And he died because he wouldn't release his victim. That's been decided by a jury. It's done." "Jury was bought. Everyone knows." "What everyone knows," Hayes interrupted, "is that you can't accept the law unless it goes your way. I sat on that jury. Garrison, I heard the evidence. Reed's a free man, and you've got no right to be here." "Rights?" The scarred rider laughed harshly. "Out here, rights come from the barrel of a gun." "Then you should know you're outgunned," Morrison observed. "Last warning, right away." Garrison's face had gone red, rage and frustration warring with survival instinct. His men were looking to him, waiting for the word. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Then one of the younger riders, barely out of his teens, made the fatal error. Whether from nerves or bloodlust, he went for his pistol. O'Brien's rifle spoke first, the shot echoing off the mountain walls. The young rider's gun flew from his hand as he cried out, clutching his shoulder. "Next one's in the heart," O'Brien shouted. "Any man moves, he dies." But the damage was done. The spell of potential peace was broken. Another rider fired wildly toward Josiah's position, and then the morning exploded into chaos. Josiah dropped behind cover as bullets whined overhead, splinters flying from the rocks. He fired methodically, picking his targets, trying to wound rather than kill. Below, horses screamed and reared as their riders fought to control them while returning fire. Morrison commanded from his position like the officer he'd been, calling out targets and coordinating fire. "Hayes, watch the flanks. O'Brien, keep them pinned." Rowena had dropped behind the water trough they'd reinforced with stones, firing with the same calm precision she'd once used for embroidery. Her third shot took a rider's hat off, sending him diving from his saddle for cover. The fight was brief but vicious. Within minutes, 3 of Garrison's men were down, wounded, not dead, though they were out of the fight. 2 more had fled, spurring their horses back down the trail. The remaining 5, including Garrison, had taken cover behind a cluster of boulders, trading shots with the defenders. "Reed," Garrison shouted during a lull. "Face me like a man. Single combat. You and me." "Don't be a fool." "Garrison," Morrison called back. "You've lost. Take your wounded and go." "I ain't leaving without justice." "Justice!" Rowena's voice rang out, clear and contemptuous. "You wouldn't know justice if it bit you. You're just a small man who can't accept that the world's changing." Shut your mouth, woman." That was a mistake. Josiah's next shot took Garrison's hat off, close enough to part his hair. "Insult my wife again," Josiah called. "And the next one's lower." The stalemate might have continued, but fate intervened in the form of Samuel Hayes. The former jury foreman had been watching the wounded riders, ensuring they didn't rejoin the fight. One of them, the scarred man who talked about rights and guns, had been playing possum. When Hayes turned to check another man, Scarface pulled a hidden derringer. Hayes saw the movement and reacted on instinct, throwing himself sideways. The derringer cracked, the small bullet catching Hayes in the side instead of the heart, even wounded. Hayes managed to club the man with his rifle stock, ending the threat. "Sam's hit," O'Brien called out. The brief distraction was all Garrison needed. He broke from cover, not retreating but charging forward, pistol in hand, screaming incoherently. Whether he was aiming for Josiah or the cabin where Rowena sheltered was unclear. He made it 3 steps. Josiah and Morrison fired simultaneously, their bullets taking Garrison in the chest and shoulder. He spun, fell, tried to rise, then collapsed face first in the dust. His pistol skittered away across the ground. "Pete!" one of his remaining men cried out. "Pete's down!" The fight went out of them then. Weapons were thrown aside, hands raised in surrender. O'Brien and Morrison moved carefully down to secure the scene, while Josiah ran to where Hayes had fallen. The wound was bad but not fatal. The derringer's small caliber had saved his life. Rowena was already there with the medical supplies, her hand steady despite the blood. "Damn fool thing to do," Hayes gasped as she worked. "Should have been watching better." "You saved lives," she told him firmly. "Now be quiet and let me save yours." The aftermath was swift and organized. Morrison took charge, treating it like a military operation. The wounded were gathered and given basic treatment. Garrison still lived, though barely. The bullets had punctured a lung, and his breathing was labored and wet. "He needs a doctor," Morrison said quietly to Josiah. "Town's closer than anywhere else. Cedar Ridge won't welcome us bringing their wounded back." "Maybe not, but we do it anyway. That's what separates us from them." They loaded the wounded onto horses and travois. 2 of Garrison's men who'd surrendered agreed to help transport them in exchange for being allowed to leave freely afterward. The 2 who'd fled early were long gone, unlikely to return. As they prepared to move out, Garrison gestured weakly for Josiah to come closer. His face was gray, blood flecking his lips. but his eyes still burned with something, not hate anymore, but perhaps understanding. "Could have killed me clean," he wheezed. "Wasn't trying to kill anyone," Josiah replied. "Just defending what's mine." Garrison coughed, wincing. "Roy, he was wrong sometimes. With the women. Knew it, but he was my friend." "I understand." "Do you?" Garrison's eyes searched his. "Man needs something to stand for, even if it's wrong. Otherwise, what's the point?" "The point," Rowena said, appearing at Josiah's shoulder, "is to stand for something better, to choose to be better." Garrison looked at her for a long moment, then managed a painful nod. "Pretty and smart. Lucky man. Read. I know it. Tell the doc. Tell him I want to make a statement about Roy, about what he did. Time someone. Told the truth." The confession surprised everyone. Morrison wrote it down carefully as Garrison spoke in halting phrases, admitting knowledge of Patterson's crimes, of complaints ignored, of a town that looked the other way because Patterson was white and his victims weren't. He died before they reached Cedar Ridge. His last words an apology, not to Josiah, but to Mary Singing Bird. The arrival of the wounded in town caused the expected sensation. Sheriff Brennan met them at the edge of town, his face unreadable as Morrison explained what had happened. "Self-defense?" Brennan asked. "Clear as day." Hayes confirmed from his travois. "I'll testify to it, as will Captain Morrison and O'Brien. They gave Garrison every chance to withdraw, and Pete made a statement before he died." Morrison handed over the written confession. "You'll want to read this. Sheriff, carefully." Brennan read, his face growing progressively grimmer. When he finished, he looked older, wearier. "This changes things," he said quietly. "Changes a lot of things." The wounded were taken to the doctor. The dead, only Garrison. In the end, to the undertaker. And word spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, carrying Garrison's confession, the failed attack, and the successful defense. By evening, when Josiah and Rowena prepared to leave town, this time, they sensed, for good, the atmosphere had changed. People still watched from doorways and windows, but the hostility had faded, replaced by something like respect, or at least understanding. Judge Morrison himself appeared as they loaded supplies, his harsh face working through complex emotions as he faced his half-brother. "William, Cornelius, I heard what happened, what Pete confessed. The truth has a way of surfacing," William said mildly, "even in dark waters." The judge turned to Josiah and Rowena. "I owe you an apology, both of you. I let my prejudices and my position blind me to justice. That's a failure I'll have to live with. Living with it is the first step," Rowena said. "What matters is what you do next." "Indeed." The judge straightened. "Mr. Reed. Mrs. Reed, you're welcome in this town whenever you choose to visit. That's official." "Appreciate it," Josiah said. "But our home's in the mountains." "I understand. But know that you have friends here now. Real friends." As they rode out of Cedar Ridge for the second time, Hayes recovering in the doctor's care, O'Brien choosing to stay and work for Morrison. The sun was setting behind the mountains, but this time they weren't fleeing. They were simply going home. "Think it's over?" Rowena asked as they climbed toward their valley. "The trouble with Garrison's bunch? Yes, but there'll always be men like him. People who can't accept change, who need someone to hate. Then we'll face them together." "Together," he agreed, reaching over to take her hand. They rode in comfortable silence as stars began to appear overhead. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, winter preparations, the cabin to finish, a life to build in their mountain sanctuary. But tonight, they were alive, they were free, and they were together. Sometimes, Josiah reflected, that's all the justice a man could ask for. Sometimes, it was more than enough. The mountains welcomed them home with a coyote's distant call and the whisper of wind through pines. And somewhere behind them, in a town wrestling with its conscience, changes began, small at first, but growing like spring flowers through snow. A new ordinance protecting all citizens regardless of race. A fund established for merry singing birds' education. A sheriff who started taking all complaints seriously. Pete Garrison's legacy. In the end, wasn't the violence he'd tried to perpetrate, but the truth his dying confession had unleashed. And in their mountain valley, building their future board by board and stone by stone, Josiah and Rowena Reed became part of that legacy, proof that love could overcome prejudice, that courage could defeat hatred, and that sometimes the wild places could teach civilization what justice truly meant. The morning Rowena discovered she was with child, the first snow of winter was falling softly on their valley. She stood at the window Josiah had installed just the week before, real glass, hauled up from Denver at considerable expense, watching the flakes drift down like blessings from heaven. "You're up early," Josiah said from the doorway, still rough with sleep. She turned to him, and something in her expression made him cross the room quickly, concern creasing his features. "What is it? Are you ill?" "No," she said softly, taking his hands and placing them on her still flat belly. "Not ill. With child." The transformation of his face, from worry to shock to a joy so profound it took her breath away, was something she would remember for the rest of her days. He dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against her stomach, his shoulders shaking with emotion he couldn't voice. "Josiah? I never thought—" His voice was raw. "After everything, after the war, the prison, the darkness, I never thought I'd have this, a home, a wife, and now, a family," she finished, running her fingers through his hair. "We're going to have a family." He stood, pulling her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. "How long have you known?" "I suspected for a few weeks, but this morning, I was certain." She smiled against his chest. "The baby should come in early summer." "Summer," he repeated wonderingly. Then, more practically, "We'll need to make changes. The cabin needs another room, and we're too far from any doctor." "Josiah," she pulled back to look at him. "Women have been having babies in these mountains long before there were doctors. We'll manage. But you're not just any woman. I'm your wife," she said firmly. "And I'm stronger than you think. We both are." The winter months that followed were a time of transformation. Josiah threw himself into preparations with the single-minded determination of a man with everything to lose and everything to protect. He expanded the cabin, adding not just one room, but two, with real wooden floors instead of packed earth. He hunted and trapped with renewed purpose, laying in supplies and trading for goods they'd need. Rowena, for her part, adapted to her changing body with grace and practicality. She'd sent word to Sister Catherine at the mission, and the nun had provided advice and promised to come when the time was near. She sewed tiny clothes by lamplight, singing lullabies she remembered from her own childhood, while Josiah carved a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth as silk. The winter was hard, but not cruel. They were snowed in for weeks at a time, but their preparations held. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Josiah reading aloud from the books Rowena had brought, Shakespeare and Dickens, poetry and philosophy, while she knitted or sewed. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, overcome by the simple miracle of their life together. "What?" she would ask, catching his look. "Just thinking how different this is from last winter. Alone in that line shack, half frozen. Sure I'd never see you again. And now I'm the richest man in the territory." He'd lean over to kiss her swelling belly, rich in all the ways that matter. Spring came slowly to the high country, but when it arrived, it exploded in a riot of wildflowers and rushing streams. Rowena, now heavy with child, would sit in the meadow while Josiah worked, sketching the mountains and writing long letters to her sister back east. Letters that painted a picture of a life so different from the one she'd left behind that it might have been another world entirely. It was on a morning in late May. with the meadow carpeted in Indian paintbrush and columbine, that her pains began. Josiah had been planning to ride to the mission that week to fetch Sister Catherine, but the baby had other plans. "It's too early," he said, trying to keep the panic from his voice. We need calm," Rowena said, though her face was pale with the first contractions. "And faith. Send Thomas for Sister Catherine. He can make the ride in half the time you can. You stay with me." Thomas, who'd chosen to remain with them as a hired hand and had proved invaluable, was dispatched on their fastest horse. Then began the longest day of Josiah's life. He'd faced Confederate charges in Union prisons, grizzly bears and winter storms, but nothing had prepared him for the helplessness of watching the woman he loved in pain he couldn't take away. He held her hands, wiped her forehead, whispered encouragements and promises, all while fighting the terror that he might lose her. Lose them both. "Tell me about the valley," she gasped between contractions. "Tell me about our children growing up here." So he did, painting word pictures of summers teaching them to fish in the creek, winters by the fire learning their letters, springs watching them race through the wildflowers. He talked until his voice grew hoarse, holding her through each wave of pain, pouring all his love and hope into words. Sister Catherine arrived as the sun was setting, bustling in with the efficient compassion of a woman who delivered dozens of babies. She took one look at Rowena and smiled. "Not long now, my dear. You're doing beautifully." And then, as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared, their daughter was born. She came into the world with a lustful cry that echoed off the mountain walls, tiny fists waving as if already reaching for all life had to offer. "A girl," Sister Catherine announced, placing the baby in Rowena's arms. "Perfect and healthy." Josiah stared at the tiny creature, unable to speak. She was so small, so perfect, with a cap of dark hair like his and her mother's determined chin. When she opened her eyes, they were gray like Rowena's, already seeming to see everything. "What shall we call her?" Rowena asked softly. "Elizabeth," Josiah said without hesitation, "after your middle name, Elizabeth Hope Reed." "Hope," Rowena repeated, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Yes, that's perfect." The summer that followed was golden with the particular joy of new life. Elizabeth, Libby, as she quickly became, was a child who seemed born to the mountains. She rarely cried, content to watch the world from her cradle on the porch or from the sling Josiah fashioned so Rowena could carry her while working in the garden they'd planted. Samuel Hayes visited in July, fully recovered from his wound and bearing gifts from Cedar Ridge, including a silver rattle from Judge Morrison, who'd included a note of congratulations and a standing offer of legal assistance should they ever need it. "Town's changing," Hayes reported over coffee. "Slowly, but changing. Mary Singingbird is studying to be a teacher. Sheriff Brennan's hired a deputy who actually believes in equal justice. And there's talk of bringing the railroad through, which would mean real growth. Progress," Josiah said neutrally. "Don't worry." Hayes smiled. "It'll be years before it reaches this far. Your valley's safe for now." As autumn approached, they established new rhythms. Josiah would take Libby with him on short trips, carrying her in a pack on his back while checking trap lines or hunting close to home. She seemed to love the movement, gurgling happily at ravens and reaching for pine branches. Rowena used the time to write, long letters, journal entries, and the beginnings of what might become a book about their life in the mountains. She also taught reading and writing to Thomas and to a young Arapaho man named Joseph Black Elk, who'd appeared one day seeking work and had stayed, becoming part of their extended family. One evening in early September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks rose and gold, Libby sleeping in her cradle between them, Rowena asked, "Do you ever regret it, leaving the solitude behind?" Josiah looked at her, then at their daughter, then at the cabin they'd built together, expanded now, with glass windows and a stone chimney that drew properly, surrounded by a garden and the beginnings of an orchard. "I wasn't living in solitude," he said finally. "I was hiding in emptiness. This," He gestured to encompass everything. This is living, as if in agreement. Libby stirred in her sleep, one tiny hand reaching out. Josiah caught it gently, marveling as he always did at the perfect miniature fingers, the absolute trust in her grip. "What are you thinking?" Rowena asked, watching him. "That I used to think the war broke me, that Andersonville stole something I could never get back, but maybe it just cleared the ground, burned away everything that didn't matter so this could grow in its place. My philosophical mountain man." She teased gently, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Your mountain man," he corrected, leaning over to kiss her. "Always." A wolf howled in the distance, answered by another, then another. Not a threat, but a celebration. A wild chorus welcoming the night. Libby slept on, safe between her parents, while the mountains stood eternal guard around their valley. They'd traveled a long road to reach this moment, through war and loss, separation and sorrow, violence and redemption. But here, in this high valley where the stars seemed close enough to touch, they'd found something worth every step of that journey. Home, family, hope. And in the years to come, as their family grew and their roots sank deeper into the mountain soil, as Cedar Ridge evolved and the frontier slowly transformed, they would look back on this evening, this perfect golden evening with their first child sleeping between them, as the moment they knew they'd truly won. Not just the trial, not just the fight for their home, but the harder battle, the fight to trust again, to love without reservation, to build something beautiful from the ashes of their pasts. As full darkness fell and they carried Libby inside, Josiah paused at the door for one last look at the valley bathed in moonlight. Somewhere out there, the world was changing, growing more civilized with each passing day. But here, in this place they'd carved from wilderness, they'd found the perfect balance between wild and tame, solitude and connection, past and future. "Coming?" Rowena called softly from inside, where lamplight cast warm shadows on wooden walls. "Coming," he confirmed, closing the door on the night. And in the small cabin in the high valley, surrounded by mountains and starlight, the Reed family settled in for another night, no longer running from anything, no longer hiding from anyone, but simply living, simply being, simply home. Thank you so much for listening to this wild journey through the untamed frontier of love and justice. I'm curious, where in the world are you enjoying this story? Drop a comment below and let's connect across the miles, just like our mountain lovers found each other against all odds. If you felt the dust of Cedar Ridge on your boots and the mountain wind in your hair, please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about Josiah and Rowena's story. Your comments fuel our campfire tales. Until we meet again on the trail, partners.